Warning! Kinda Murdery contains adult themes, explicit language, and descriptions of violence. It is not suitable for anyone, and we recommend you stop listening now.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Kinda Murdery, a true crime podcast that's mostly about murder, and always about the strange and compelling stories that arise when the path less traveled twists to darkness, and those who walk its shadows surrender to violence and moral corruption. We have a perilous journey ahead, so thank you for lending me your courage and good company. I'm Zevin Odelberg, and this is Kinda Murdery. Glad to be here with you, everyone. You know, a couple episodes ago, I told a story about pirates. River pirates, yeah, but pirates nonetheless. Today's story isn't about pirates, but it does have some pirate-ish elements. I found it as written in an article entitled The Parrot, the Trunk, and the Murder by Joseph W. Gavin in the April 1929 issue of True Detective magazine. As always, all my sources are in the show notes. Now, I almost called this story Pollywanna Murder, but that didn't seem fair because the parrot in this particular tale of violence and degraded human nature definitely did not want to murder. In fact, if anything, he wanted to solve one. Now, there's a famous pirate saying I'm sure you're familiar with. Dead men tell no tales. Well, dead men may not, but in today's story, it appears that live birds absolutely do. And that's not the only pirate-ish aspect of the tale I'm about to tell. I mean, let's think about it. What are some of the key things that the pirates of popular imagination are known for? Well, 1. Parrots. Long John Silver, from the Treasure Island movie, the inspiration for just about every television and film, and frankly a lot of literature pirates as well. Well, Long John Silver had a parrot named Pieces of Eight perpetually perched on his shoulder, usually mocking him. Besides parrots, another thing pirates are known for? Well, trunks. Chests. Treasure chests, actually, but a trunk is a synonym for chest. And, well, 3? 3 should maybe be 1. I mean, murder. Pirates are a famously murdery bunch. Now again, this is not a pirate story, but it does illustrate how important context is, because out of context, from parrots to treasure chests and murder, it sure does sound like a pirate story. Although to be fair, treasure chest is a wildly inaccurate description here, because the chest or trunk in this story was not full of treasure, no. It was full of the medically dismembered and horribly mutilated body of Gus Bowles. Why was that? What happened to him? Who's responsible? Well, if you'd like to find that out, I'd like to find that out, then please join me as we uncover what truths we can and solve what mysteries we may on today's Not About Pirates murder story. Kinda Murderies. The Parrot Wants to Know What Happened to Gus. Starts now. All was quiet in New York Police Headquarters. It was a Tuesday morning in late January 1887. Inspector Burns, chief of the Detective Bureau, was congratulating his subordinates on the absence of mysterious crimes and crimes of violence, and the police commissioner was telling visitors from Canada that New York was the best governed and most peaceable city in the world. At that precise moment, a messenger boy, all sweaty from a long run, rushed up to Inspector Burns with a telegram. Across the envelope was stamped in large letters, "Immediate and urgent." The inspector at once tore open the envelope, read the message, and told the messenger that there was, quote, "no answer," unquote. His face looked suddenly grave. The message came from Police Marshal Frey of Baltimore. Briefly, it stated that the headless and dismembered body of a man had been discovered packed in a trunk which had been shipped the previous Saturday from New York to Baltimore, that the murderer had cut up his victim as a butcher would a calf, and that indications pointed to the crime having been committed in New York. Now, when such knowledge as this comes to the head of the detective force of any large city, one of the results is certain to be screaming headlines in the newspapers and editorial demands for immediate action on the part of the police. And Burns prepared for action. With the energy that always characterized him, he summoned a battalion of detectives, including George Titus and William McLaughlin, as well as Magan and Von Garrickton. The police headquarters at once became a beehive of activity. "What time does the next train leave the city for Baltimore?" Inspector Burns asked Titus. The detective consulted a timetable. "Just an hour from now, Inspector," he said. Burns then handed Titus the telegram he'd received from Marshal Frey and told him to go at once to Baltimore. He was to telephone or wire all particulars of the mystery that he could gather at the earliest possible moment. Half an hour later, Titus and John D. Lindsay of District Attorney Delancey Nichols' staff were on their way to the railroad station. Each wore a contemplative air, and each had a keen sense of responsibility and loyalty to his chief. In the meantime, Burns had assigned other detectives to visit pawn shops and second-hand clothing stores in order to trace the murdered man's clothing and jewelry, which, the telegram stated, had been stripped from the body before it was thrown into the trunk. The head of the Missing Persons Bureau was asked to throw a dragnet over the city and to ascertain if any men had just disappeared. The steamboat squad was directed to patrol the North and East rivers and to keep a sharp lookout for all floating objects, particularly such as might conceal the head of a man. Stool pigeons, that's criminal informants, were also requested to visit the resorts of Italian counterfeiters and members of the mafia, and to report immediately any information they could pick up that might lead to the identification of the murdered man. In short, there was no known criminal meeting place in all of New York City that was left uninvestigated by the police. The murder trunk and its contents were placed in front of detectives Titus and Lindsay in Baltimore. It was a ghastly sight indeed. The trunk had an oval top and smelled to high heaven. Inside was still packed the mutilated body of what had once been a man. The limbs had been severed with the greatest care, the head and neck removed from the torso in a manner that suggested the work of a skilled surgeon. The legs cut from the trunk and the feet from the legs. Everything about the dismemberment showed that the person who did the cutting was no novice at dissection. Titus noticed that the hands of the murdered man were soft and bore no indications of manual labor, that the fingernails were well manicured, that the victim was well nourished and fastidiously careful of his person. So he had great hygiene and he took good care of himself. Titus also noticed that the neck had been severed by a razor or some other very sharp instrument, and that the amputation of the legs had been done by a saw. He asked Marshal Frey for the particulars. The marshal told him that the trunk had arrived in Baltimore by the Adams Express on Sunday, January 22nd. It was addressed to John A. Wilson, Baltimore, Maryland. Underneath the address were the words, "To be kept till called for." My goodness, to be kept till called for? You know, I'm lucky enough to be able to say that I have some very good and very loyal friends. I imagine many of you listening do as well. Friends who would, quote, do anything for us, so to speak, right? But, boy, can you imagine having a ship ahead to 'em to hold until you asked for it, friend? Now that is friendship. People always talk about relationship goals or friendship goals. Well, here's mine. I want to have a friend so good that they'll babysit a severed head for me and then produce it on demand. That is a good friend. I jest, of course. I don't actually need a babysitter for severed heads. I'm not a psycho killer. But I think we can all agree that that does sort of set a new bar for loyalty and friendship. All right, back to the story. No one came to pick up the trunk on Sunday or Monday. It was taken on Tuesday from the Calvert Street station to the company's freight station on North Street. When it was turned over to the baggage master, he immediately shouted, "Oh my God! The smell from that trunk is horrible. There's some dead thing inside, I know it. Send for the police." Superintendent Schuler was sent for and had the trunk removed to the Central Police Station, where the lid was torn off and the horrible sight revealed. The horrible sight being the dismembered and decapitated body that we just described previously. The Baltimore police and Detective Titus figured that the victim weighed about 160 pounds, was 5 feet 9 inches tall, and of fair complexion. As the head and neck were missing, no one could fix the man's age. The inside of the trunk was covered with blood, indicating that the ghastly packing had been done before rigor mortis set in. The newspaper reporters now pressed Detective Titus for his opinion about the crime. The Baltimore newspapers were hungry for news, and their reporters used every trick known to the profession to wheedle some out of Detective Titus. A patiently planned, cold-blooded killing done by one of the most vengeful and abnormal characters that any novelist could invent was all the detective could be induced to say. His face was very grave as he left the police station to communicate with Inspector Burns. Meanwhile, Marshal Frey had called all his detectives into conference. Recalling the old adage that 2 heads are better than 1, the marshal asked each man for his opinion as to where the murder was committed and its background, telling them that any theory or train of thought that might lead to results was welcome. Some of the detectives thought that the crime had been committed in Chicago and that the trunk had been shipped from there to New York and then reshipped from New York to Baltimore in order to mislead and puzzle the police. They based this theory upon a tag tied to one end of the murder trunk containing a label for the Chicago and Rock Island Railroad, Dearborn Station. Marshal Frey liked this idea and had sent a telegram to the Chicago police at the same time that he sent a similar one to Inspector Burns in New York. A few of Marshall's detectives conjectured that the murdered man was an Irishman who had been removed by agents of some secret revolutionary organization for some real or supposed treachery to Ireland, which is a convoluted way of saying that they thought he was an IRA vengeance killing. Others thought he was a Sicilian counterfeiter done to death by the mafia for disloyalty to his associates or failure to give them a proper split of the proceeds of some sale of fake money. Whatever opinion I may have is not of any value as evidence in the case, Detective Titus replied mysteriously. The coroner gave Titus permission to take the murder trunk and the body of the unfortunate man whose dismembered remains filled it back to New York. And with that, the curtain fell on the Baltimore act of the sad drama, leaving the crime as deep and dark a mystery as ever. When the murder trunk and its gory contents arrived in New York, Inspector Burns made a careful examination of the handwriting of the address to which it had been sent. The script was in a bold, businesslike hand, indicating a man accustomed to writing, and of more than ordinary intelligence. The ink with which it was written was blue, an unusual shade. The trunk was of cheap material and differed in no ways from an ordinary piece of luggage. Burns was holed up in his private office for a long time with Detective Titus. When he emerged, there was a puzzled look on his face. Titus had reported that one of the murdered man's fingers was deformed as a result of having been broken and improperly set, and that it was possible that some doctor might remember having been consulted about it. On hearing this, Burns paced his office restlessly. Someone who knew the detective well might have noticed an unfamiliar tension in the man who was usually so well composed. Had the Baltimore detectives overlooked this finger? They had overlooked or withheld from the reporters other clues, each of which might lead to the apprehension of the murderer or murderers. But the Baltimore detectives purposely withheld information from the newspaper men, fearing its publication would reveal to the slayer the clues they had in their possession. Marshal Frey from Baltimore thought that secrecy was absolutely essential at this stage of the investigation, and New York's Detective Titus agreed with him. The clues upon which the detectives now hoped to get at the truth of the tragedy included a white calico shirt with polka dots, which the murdered man wore. Under an edge, which was folded and apparently ironed with a sinister purpose, was the name C. Kampfhold. This had been written in indelible ink, in a script which indicated some attempt at disguise. Beneath the white linen undershirt, which was on the body, and stuck to the man's back, was a business card on which was printed E. D. Siegel, Meats and Provisions, 205 Throop Avenue, Brooklyn, New York. Another card read, London and Manchester Plate Glass Company, 73-75 Worcester Street, New York. These seemed clues indeed, and in the darkness, even the faintest gleam of light was eagerly welcomed by the police. Detective Titus informed District Attorney Nickel by telephone of the latest developments in the case. While this was happening in New York, Inspector Riley of the Eastern District of Brooklyn was running down some clues which involved members of the Mafia. The inspector believed that the murder bore all the earmarks of that secret assassination society, and that the victim had been drugged and rendered unconscious before he was killed. His men were instructed to make careful inquiries about missing Italians. 2 detectives were at once dispatched to Siegel's butcher shop with instructions to bring him to police headquarters if he refused to answer any questions or showed any signs of suspicious behavior. Given the way the body had been cut up, Siegel seemed like a promising lead, and the detectives entered his shop excitedly. E.D. Siegel was a mild-mannered man with gray hair and a mustache and a strong hawk-like profile. He became terribly excited when asked if he could explain how his card got into the murder trunk. He gesticulated wildly and flung his arms about in an attitude of despair. "How do I know?" he exclaimed. Forgive my German accent there, but he is German. And, what the heck, I'm gonna go for it. "How do I know? My business cards are lying around here by the dozen, and everybody who calls is at liberty to take one or more of them." Then, Siegel took off his belt, apron, and jacket. "I do not know any man named C. Kampfold," he stammered, "and I feel sure that those who butchered this man you speak of are not customers of mine." Jiminy, how would you be sure of that? I mean, if you're sure they're not customers, is that because you did it yourself, not your customers? Also, I mean, if you're innocent, using the verb butchered to describe how the man was killed, probably an unwise or at least unfortunate choice. If you're guilty, it seems more like a subconscious admission. But who knows, maybe I'm getting way over my skis here. Oh, but maybe not. It seems like the detectives agree with me. It says right here, the second remark coming from the butcher struck the detectives as rather ludicrous, but looking at the man, they were impressed in spite of themselves by an eerie notion that what he said might be true. They left, leaving Siegel wide-eyed. The large force of detectives employed on the case, the frequent reports which they made to Inspector Burns, and the silence of the inspector himself was remarkable. The detectives were divided in their opinions regarding the motive of the butchery, and this was very important because without establishing a motive, an indictment for murder in the first degree would not stand. Some of the detectives thought that the victim was an Italian blackmailer or counterfeiter, and that the butchery was the work of the Mafia. These theorists pointed to the horrible mutilation of the body as proof of Sicilian vengeance. Others believed the crime was committed by an indignant husband, smarting under the belief that the victim had broken up his home and dishonored his wife. A few imagined that the victim had been held up by a gang who he double-crossed. Trunk manufacturers who examined the bloody trunk shook their heads and expressed the belief that the box was manufactured in Chicago. Naturally, the question then arose again. Was the murder trunk shipped from Chicago to New York and later shipped to Baltimore to bamboozle the police? Inspector Burns was a remarkably discreet man, and this was no exception. All the reporters could induce him to say regarding the Chicago angle of the case or any of the other angles was simply, "Well, I don't know what to think." The situation was greatly complicated by an influx of letters from cranks and busybodies offering theories and suggestions and supplying what some of them called straight tips to the police. Inspector Burns was getting more mail than ever before in his life, and so was Inspector O'Reilly. One hot tip claimed that the murdered man was a resident of Centerport, Long Island, and known there as Chris Kampfold. The report ran that Kampfold had been treading the primrose path of dalliance since he came to Long Island and getting more than the yellow primrose, which is an exceptionally polite and poetic way of saying he was committing adultery, or, put more bluntly, banging other men's wives. The report further stated that he disappeared some weeks back and that his sudden exit from the neighborhood was connected with threats made by a married man and a confession by the man's wife. The alleged aggrieved husband was sought out and found. Asked if he knew C. Kampfold, the man cursed and spat out, "I only hope that somebody around here had the spunk to kill that blankety-blank Dutchman." Dang, that reminds me of Austin Powers' Goldmember, where Austin's father, Nigel Powers, played brilliantly by Michael Caine, says,
"There are only 2 things I can't stand in this world. People who are intolerant of other people's cultures and the Dutch."
Man, that line's always cracked me up. All right, that's enough of a levity break. Let's get back to our very serious, dark story. So it seems that this angry husband in Long Island did indeed know the victim, a C. Kampfhold, and that Kampfhold was an adulterer, a womanizer, and had certainly stirred up hate in at least one heart and at least one community. But we'll see what unfolds. Although Burns and his battalion of detectives were concentrating on New York for clues, and Inspector O'Reilly was hoping that Brooklyn would supply the key to the mystery, Burns checked up on reports from Chicago that an Irishman, once prominent in Irish secret revolutionary societies, had not been seen for several weeks, and his friends feared that he'd been slain by someone who wrongfully connected him with giving information to the British government. This man worked for the Chicago and Rock Island Railroad, the card of which was found in the murder coffin in Baltimore. Dang, the plot thickens. I mean, it seems virtually impossible that our murder victim could be both the philandering Dutchman, C. Kampfhold, and also a potentially loose-lipped, railroad-working, former member of the IRA Irishman from Chicago. Those are pretty different identities. Unless it's the dismembered body of a super spy that was shoved into the bloody trunk, those are probably two different men, although there seems to be clues arguing on behalf of both of them. Alright, back to it. So the missing and presumed murdered Irishman was a member of the Chicago and Rock Island Railroad, and the railroad card had been found in the murder coffin in Baltimore. The fierce dissensions among the two factions of Irish revolutionaries in Chicago at the time, that would be the IRA on one side and the Ulster Volunteer Force on the other, I believe, and their charges that a British spy was high in the councils of the IRA lent color to the theory that the slain man was a Chicagoan. You know, I need to correct myself here. I've been using the wrong name, the presumptive modern name of these Irish revolutionary groups. The IRA wasn't actually founded as the IRA until 1919, so when this story's taken place in 1887, I believe the Irish revolutionary group at that time would have been called the Fenians. If anybody knows more and wants to correct me, please do reach out at Kinda Murdery on all social media, kindamurdery@gmail.com, or you can call the Kinda Murdery hotline, 888-MURDERY, that's 888-687-3379. And while we're on the subject of reaching out to me, as always, please also feel free to reach out to me if you're going through a tough time and you'd like to connect with someone, or if you'd like to share your story about a particular set of challenges or unique circumstances in your life. As I often talk about, I think it's really important that we share our unique life stories so that we can all become more human to each other, and not just others, but we can all see each other as the connected people that we are, and come to understand that no matter how different our lives may be, we're still all human, we still have the same hopes and fears and dreams and loves and hates, etc. Well, hopefully we don't all have the same loves and hates. That could lead to trouble, but I think you take my point. Feel free to reach out to me if you'd like to share your story or your thoughts, and of course, please do call the hotline 888-MURDERY, 888-687-3379, to tell me your Kinda Murdery story, and maybe you can inspire an episode of the show. Also, please do remember the free Lifeline number 988, that's 988, please program it into your phone now, that you can call anytime, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to receive immediate counseling for substance use, mental health, or suicidal thoughts. So if, God forbid, you find yourself in a really dark place, please do call 988. And please do remember that you are loved and the world is a better place with you in it. Okay, thank you for giving me a moment to share that. Let's get back to the story. So, rumors that there was a British spy among the Irish revolutionaries in Chicago, and that a former member of the revolutionaries, or potentially former member of the revolutionaries, had recently disappeared and was a member of the railroad whose card was found in the murder trunk, that lent credence to the idea that perhaps the murdered man was from Chicago. Of course, there's also the furious husband in Long Island who knows that his wife has been cheating with a Dutchman named C. Kampfhold, which is the name that was found inside the victim's shirt sleeve. So there seems to be somewhat compelling evidence that this murder victim could be either from Chicago Or the philandering Dutchman from Long Island. We got to get to the bottom of this. But we're not the only ones who need to get to the bottom of it. So does Inspector Burns and his cadre of dedicated New York police murder detectives. Alright, so word now went through underground channels to the reporters that Inspector Burns had sent an additional fleet of detectives into Brooklyn to discover the murderer, and that he had personally assumed charge of the invading host of detectives. The invading host is the fleet of detectives he sent into Brooklyn. This was front page news because it indicated that Burns was not at all satisfied with the work of Inspector Riley and his men in Brooklyn. The truth is, Inspector Burns was never popular with reporters and not even with many of his own detectives. Titus and McLaughlin had more shining qualities as manhunters and a more extensive knowledge of criminals and their ways than Inspector Burns, but somehow it always felt as though the roots of Inspector Burns' understanding went far deeper than those of any of his subordinates. His conscious mind would often hold to superficial and indefensible opinions, but every now and then something awe-inspiring would manifest itself in him, as if he were the voice of an inspired being. This made him more interesting than any other detective on his squad. As a matter of fact, Burns never believed that the murdered man was an Italian. He thought the body too large and too fair-skinned. At any rate, it was deemed necessary for some experienced hand to supervise the operations in the Eastern District of Brooklyn, which had never had an enviable reputation among policemen at that time, and perhaps no better supervisor could have been found than Inspector Burns. One day shortly after this, with the whole country watching the swiftly shifting scenes, the efforts to solve the mystery gave rise to new hopes when two of the inspector's detectives reported that they had proof that the murder trunk had been shipped from the Eastern District of Brooklyn on Saturday, January 21st by the Westcott Transfer Company, which delivered it to the Adams Express Company in New York that afternoon. The receipt which they exhibited confirmed this conclusion. Through some secret channels and stool pigeons whose names were not to be revealed, and whose methods of operation are atypical to say the least, the detectives obtained other information relative to the trunk which led the inspector to believe that Brooklyn held the key to the mystery. After studying the express receipt with the closest attention, Burns removed his eyeglasses. His eyes sparkled with excitement. "Well," he remarked gruffly, "can you beat that?" The detective to whom this query was addressed smiled wanly and tossed a card to the inspector. On the card was engraved, "Henry Bentz, Wines and Liquors, 395 Kent Avenue, Brooklyn, New York." "The murder trunk was shipped from that guy's saloon," said the detective, pointing to the name on the card. Burns beamed across the desk at the detective. "Could Bentz give any enlightened description of the man who shipped it?" he asked. "He could and he did," answered the detective. "He told me that on the morning of Saturday, January 21st, a thick-set man about 55 years of age, of medium height, with gray hair and a gray mustache, came into the saloon. After buying some drinks and treating all hands at the bar, he asked permission to leave in the back room a trunk which he had on the sidewalk until he got an expressman to take it away. The permission was granted. The man then asked for a pen, ink, and paper. The ink given to him was blue, of the same shade as that with which the address on the murder trunk was written. Half an hour later, the expressman called for the trunk, gave Bentz a receipt for it, and put it into his wagon. The detective added that there was nothing to indicate with certainty that Bentz was prevaricating or withholding any information that could throw further light on the tragedy. Another new development, the strangest in the case, now engrossed the attention of Inspector Burns. One of his detectives made a report which filled him with radiant energy. Wow, that's really excited. If you've got radiant energy, you are excited. This new development that had Inspector Burns positively radiating was a report that, quote, something unusual, unquote, was taking place in the apartment of Edward Unger on the 5th floor of a tenement at 22 Ridge Street, Manhattan. An elderly woman who lived in the tenement was complaining that the rooms were the scene of misconduct of some kind. "The Parrot," she remarked to the grocer. "It's raising the dickens. Nobody ever heard that bird screaming so loudly or so frequently. All I could understand of his gab was, 'Where's Gus? Where's Gus?'" Where's Gus, indeed? And if you'd like to know, just like this parrot would like to know, just what happened to Gus, then please do rejoin me this Thursday for Part 2, the thrilling conclusion of Kinda Murdery's The Parrot Wants to Know What Happened to Gus. Until then, thank you so much for being here. I look forward to seeing you on Thursday. I'm Zevin Odelberg, and this has been Kinda Murdery.